Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Wealth Planning for Global Families in the US event. I'm Caroline Renaud. I'm the Executive Director of Gaba, the German-American Business Association. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a few words about Gaba because I can see from the attendees that some of you are new to our events. Gaba is an alliance of corporations, organizations, and professionals with the purpose of strengthening transatlantic business. Gaba is a non-profit organization promoting business between California and Germany, and we are only funded by membership and event fees. And we are a networking organization, so we usually offer a lot of panel discussions and networking events in person. Unfortunately, that's not possible at the moment. So we've been working on a series of online events, both panel discussion and expert events like we have today. Because we want to stay in touch with our community, give our Gaba members the opportunity to stay connected and exchange some ideas. And I see from the registration that we have a lot of Gaba members attending today. And so I would like to say that we really appreciate your support at this difficult times. Thanks a lot for being a Gaba member. For those of you who are not a member of Gaba yet, we have some exciting membership promotions coming up, and you will receive an email with an offer after this call. So look out for that. And I hope some of you will join this great community. So let's get started with the program. I'm very excited about the program today, which fits very well with our community, with our international community. And I'd like to introduce you to our presenters today. So we have Andrew Fisher. He is the president of Worldview Wealth Advisors, an independent firm specializing in financial planning and wealth management for global families. Andrew recently authored the Cross-Border Family Wealth Guide, the leading resource on financial planning for globally mobile families. Andrew also presented to us already a few years back. It was very well attended and very informative. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from him again. So we have a second presenter, that's Libby Dawson. She's a senior advisor with Worldview with a focus on wealth management and financial planning for families with somewhat complex personal financial situations. Libby has lived all over the world, so she understands the benefits and challenges that go with cross-border life. So with that, Andrew, would you like to take over?
If I can figure out how to turn my mute off, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Caroline. Much appreciate you all having us here. We're happy to be now a corporate sponsor or a corporate member of the community, and very, very pleased to be welcomed here today. There is a lot of interest in this topic. Obviously, we're in a very strange time with the pandemic. And I think it's particularly hard amongst the community of people who we support, who tend to be very global, have very mobile lives. And we're all sort of locked down at the moment, which maybe is especially hard through the month of August. But anyway, we do appreciate you all tuning in. We hope we can give some good information to everyone here. Everyone's camera and mic will be muted and turned off today. We have a chat tool if you have any administrative questions. We do have a moderator paying attention to that. And then there's a Q&A tool. Please put any questions, not too personalized, and we will have time at the end to answer them. As Caroline said, I am Andrew Fisher, the president and founder of Worldview Wealth Advisors. I'll skip through some of my bio, but just to say that I've been working in the international world of international business, international investing, until I went into advising families 18 years ago. And I really wanted to bring sort of my love of travel and language and international culture into the realm of wealth management. And so I feel very fortunate to have decided to specialize in this unique community, which is extremely varied and diverse and interesting. And so we love that. So thank you for having us. Worldview, as Caroline mentioned, is based in San Francisco, and we are an independent financial planning and wealth management firm for cross-border families, both into the US and also outbound from the US. Libby?
Hello, everyone. I am Libby Dawson, and I've been working with Andrew for going on about 4 years now as a wealth advisor. I also have about 20 years of experience in financial services with equity research, investment banking. I went off and did my MBA and then went into investment management, working with institutional investors and individual investors. But as Caroline already mentioned, perhaps even more applicable is that I have been an expat myself. And I lived abroad for 11 years in Canada and also in Switzerland. And so when I discovered this specialty, it's something that's very near and dear to my heart. And I very much sympathize with some of the frustrations that some of you all might be going through when you talk at some of the financial issues that we're going to cover today. So if we could just take a minute and let you know what we are going to be talking about. First of all, we are not ourselves immigration attorneys, nor are we tax professionals. We are financial advisors. And our presentation really is an overview of the range of financial questions and concerns that you might have. And as Andrew mentioned, the cross-border world is really diverse. We come across lots of different situations, which make it interesting. But today, we're going to focus predominantly on foreign-born professionals who have come into the US. And here in California, we are very, very fortunate because there is a significant concentration of these very, very talented people, largely because, of course, of the tech sector, but also because of the vibrant startup community that we have here. So we know that you face unique financial challenges and often have a hard time finding answers and some good advice. So we're going to walk through the overview of what we see in this area. So the presentation is divided up into phases. First is arrival. So if you're new to the US, next up is extended stay, which is if you've been here for a while and you're having to make some important financial decisions. Then is permanent home, which highlights financial options if you intend to truly stay in the US and perhaps retire here. And then lastly is departure, or really the things you have to think about if you are deciding to leave the US. We will leave some time for questions at the end. And absolutely, if we don't have the opportunity to answer your question, please don't hesitate to contact us separately to follow up, and we'd be happy to try to help you out. Okay, so the first section is really thinking about the topics that would be key to anyone who's new to the US. And for this audience, maybe this is old news at the moment, but just to go over things, the first process is going to be around immigration, which of course can be quite complicated. But for those of you working with larger companies, this fortunately is handled for you. We encounter another group of people, typically entrepreneurs, who have come either on a student or even tourist visas and then establish themselves. The first financial aspect is setting up a bank account here in the US, which is relatively straightforward, fortunately. But we would like to impress upon you the need to keep open a bank account in your home country. And that's because a lot of places have restrictions on non-residents. So it's in your interest to keep that account in place. Part of what you need to think about is just the mundane cash transfers and how to deal with more than one currency. The US system is really pretty good internally, but less so internationally. And so we often recommend having accounts with some of the larger institutions that can handle different currencies and currency transfers. Establishing credit here in the US is very important. The US is absolutely parochial when it comes to credit histories and does not look outside its borders. And I can tell you from personal experience, I was away for 11 years, and the only credit card that I got when I returned had a $200 credit limit to it, which was crazy, right? So you do need to start a credit history, of course, for credit cards. which we still are in love with here in the US, but more importantly, so that you'll be able to get a car loan and a mortgage in the future. With my $200 credit card history that I was able to establish back in the US, I had a real hard time trying to get my first mortgage when we got back. The biggest thing that people coming into the US talk to us about really is an introduction to the US tax system. So first of all, beyond just being new to you, it is more complicated than in many other places with its deductions and credits and various tax rates. And I personally think that really it's needlessly complicated, but that is my personal opinion. Regardless, it takes some getting used to and some education. And of course, it is notorious for being worldwide and imposing taxes on all income and capital gains, regardless of where these are incurred. This is a shock to some people and can feel intrusive and really even abusive to many of the folks that we talk to. So yes, if you sell a property abroad, the US has the right to tax you. So fortunately, there is also a system of tax treaties so that in most cases there are foreign tax credits or exclusions. This means that it's rare that you are double taxed, but in general, you are going to pay the higher of the two tax rates between the US and your home country whenever that is applicable. Regardless, your tax reporting burden does go up. Included in this is the need to report your foreign assets to the IRS, depending on the amount, and sometimes in duplicate, which is onerous and really very, very irritating, and I feel your pain. This is to minimize tax evasion and money laundering, so it's for a good purpose, and other countries have similar programs in place, and foreign asset reporting requirements are only going up in a lot of places around the world. So understanding the basics of how the system works can be critical to making some smart decisions before you move, which for you all, I'm sorry if this is a little bit too late, but the first would be to know if anything would change or impede with any of your accounts that you hold abroad. Sometimes there are restrictions or accounts can even be shut down once you become a US resident. The second, and perhaps more important, is just having that basic understanding of the tax code in your home country versus that in the US to see if there are any transactions that you should make before you move. So if you're moving from a lower tax environment, can you advance any income? Can you sell assets to realize any gains? Vice versa, of course, if you're moving from a higher tax environment. And perhaps you should consider certain structures. We had a client who was an entrepreneur, set up a company in Germany, and then was acqui-hired into a company in the US. He did very well. He was very happy with all that. But several years later, he and his tax people were working themselves up into knots, trying to minimize his taxes because his business entity didn't translate well into the US system. So we always recommend to people that they think about these things, if possible, before you move. Okay, so Andrew, I'm gonna pass it to you. What should we think about while you're here?
Thank you, Libby. That's great. And a lot of people come here who we meet, and maybe it's temporary initially, or they're not sure if they'll like living here. And they have some initial success. There are parts of the US, California, which are beautiful. And they decide to extend that stay a little bit. Maybe it's indefinitely. And they start thinking a little bit more about saving money, about making smart personal financial decisions, and of course, learning more about personal finance here in the United States. One of the first things that will frequently change at this juncture is their employment status. They may have come on as a contract employee, or perhaps they came on an assignment as an assignee from another jurisdiction, and now they're offered the opportunity to become a localized employee. Oftentimes that will bring quite a few additional benefits, like a 401k plan, health savings account, employee stock purchase plans, insurance, various types of insurance, and maybe even more senior executive type benefits like deferred compensation, for example. Employee stock compensation is another big one that they may begin to become eligible for around this extended stay time. In the technology space here in Northern California, often stock-based compensation is a very large part of the overall compensation program. And I'll just spend a few moments explaining the two key types. You have stock grants, like an RSU, and then you have options. RSUs tend to be much more common now, especially amongst large corporations, and they're effectively a multi-year bonus commitment, which is linked to the share price of the stock. And so if the stock price were to double, of course, then the bonus that you earn upon vesting into that year's portion is twice as large. Now, the way it works upon vest is taxes are withdrawn, and then the final shares or the rest of that bonus is delivered to you in the form of shares. Options are a bit more complex in that they are the right to buy shares at a certain price, which you then often have 10 years or more to exercise, and that entire amount becomes like a bonus or a taxable gain at ordinary tax rates. These stock compensation programs are often some of the best ways to accumulate wealth, partially due to the concentration in one stock and also the leverage that's inherent in some of these structures. But they also tend to be one's highest risk asset. And so we often work with clients to help them understand the goal needs to be to take advantage of these to grow wealth, and then be thinking about diversification over time as a way to build and then just spread that out and lower risk. Another big question mark around this time of extending your stay is real estate, where to live, what to do with your former residences. And the decision about renting versus buying, I'm sure almost everyone on this call would strongly prefer to buy. Virtually all of our clients have a strong desire and end up purchasing as quickly as they can. Of course, it makes establishing credit quickly very important. We do caution some people who are younger that are still very mobile, moving around the world, that renting can be a good choice just to preserve that flexibility. Now, ownership in the US does have tax advantages, the deductibility of both mortgage interest as well as property taxes. And if you're in a high tax bracket in a high tax state like California, that can be pretty meaningful. However, those benefits were greatly diminished in 2018 with the new tax rules that limited substantially the SALT tax deductions, which is state and local tax. So your state income tax and property tax together, many times in the past would be $50,000 or $100,000 per year, are now capped at $10,000. So it greatly reduces the benefit, particularly for people in a high value real estate market who are in a high tax state like California. Something to think about. Almost every successful foreign family that we meet owns a rental property, usually their former residences back in their home country or maybe in another country where they used to work before moving to the US. It's very common that those aren't reported here to the IRS. Of course, they're required to be reported, and they really should be reported. And part of the reason for that, other than it's the law, is that it's very unlikely to cost you anything in terms of tax. The US has a very beneficial tax shelter on rental properties and property in general, income property, where you have your inflows minus your outflows, and then you also are able to deduct a non-cash depreciation expense until such time that you sell the property in the future, which really makes it very tax smart. And if you combine that with the fact that most rental properties internationally, you're paying some tax on that income in that foreign country, very unlikely that you would owe additional tax. Another thing that we strongly recommend considering is when converting a long-time personal residence to a rental property, you have 3 years after which point you lose your capital gain exemption for a primary residence, which is $500,000 if you're married, $250,000 if you're single. So if you have a highly appreciated home that you've been renting for the first few years just to see how things go in the US, and it has a large gain, you should seriously consider whether you want to hold that forever, and if not, to sell it before you can capture that $500,000 gain exemption. It can be extremely valuable, worth as much as perhaps $250,000 to you to recognize that. Some people say, well, I really want to always have that property. And I'll tell them, well, maybe you should even consider selling that property and then immediately buying one across the hall, just to raise your basis in the property, because that's an asset, that gain exemption. The last thing about real estate is just people should be mindful that owning foreign real estate as a US taxpayer can have certain currency risks due to fluctuation. You could purchase a property for €1,000,000 and sell it 5 years later for €1,000,000. But if the US currency were to decline relative to the euro, you would actually have a taxable gain in the US, even though you had no gain at all. So very strange. The next point is accumulating wealth. Around this time, we see people doing well in their jobs and starting to build up some financial wealth. And so we really are often educating people about how to take care of that, because the world is really changing, and the responsibility for saving and accumulating and doing smart things with your money, it's shifted to the individual from the old days of really relying on your country or the state, or maybe on your lifetime employer to take care of you in your retirement. It really is on all of us individually. And so stock market investing and understanding what it means to own a share of a company, a minority share, is really an important element of investing for your future. And just learning that it's not gambling. It's very much an economic share of a company, which has proven to be one of the best ways to grow inflation-adjusted wealth. It's not perfect. It has its drawbacks. It can be random for long periods of time, but it is a smart way to invest. And of course, when you're constructing an investment portfolio, you want to usually mix owning equities or stocks with bonds and other safe investments to create an asset allocation mix that is appropriate for your risk level. And very often the 401k is the first place where that's done. So let me briefly talk about 401ks, and then I'll move it back to Libby. This is a huge area of interest for people who first come here. When they learn about the basic benefits of a 401k, we see a lot of our clients participate very heavily. Really, a 401k allows for the pre-tax deferral of some of one's salary into a special account, which can be invested and can grow then on a tax deferred basis over many, many years. And in our experience, virtually all of our clients participate, and usually at the maximum amount that's allowed. There are some alternative plans. A Roth 401k has become very popular, and we love Roth 401ks. But in particular, we like them for people at a lower income level who tend to be at a lower tax bracket, a lower tax rate. And so then paying the tax now, they're able to put money away after tax with the promise, the way Roths work is the promise of tax-free growth over their lifetime, which is extremely valuable. Now, one caution we give to people who may be living abroad later on in their lives is that Roths are far less recognized internationally than a 401k or an IRA is. And so be careful about making a tax-free growth Roth the centerpiece of a savings plan if you think there's a chance you're going to live abroad again, because how sad would that be to pay all the tax in hopes of this tax-free growth and then to end up in a country that does not respect that. After tax 401ks are another flavor, which are really wonderful, which just allow, after you've reached the maximum for the tax advantaged portion, to then put even more away. A lot of people ask how they should be invested. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, it should be risk appropriate. If you're younger, perhaps you could be more aggressive. If you're closer to retirement, perhaps you would dial down stocks in favor of more safe bonds to preserve the value of that account. You're closer to the time when you're going to need it. We believe strongly in global diversification. The US is roughly 50% of the world market cap. This audience, this community understands that we are in a global world, a global economy, and we believe portfolios should match that. Sometimes building a global portfolio inside of a 401k can be a challenge. There are fewer international stock funds, although that's getting better. The bigger challenge is with foreign bond funds. There may be some foreign bond fund options in your 401k plan, but in our experience, 100% of those are perfectly hedged back to the dollar. So if you're nearing retirement and you're low risk in your investment strategy, and you think that you're globally hedged by having a large portion of those bonds into a foreign bond fund in your 401k plan, sadly, you are not hedged away from the dollar. And I have seen this. Actually, a German client of mine who spent many years at Adidas in the US was ready to retire with over $1 million in a 401k plan that was very conservatively invested. And just before retiring back to Europe, the dollar fell sharply. So this was a while ago, and meaningfully lowered her buying power in Europe just at the worst time. So it can happen. It's something to think of. Libby? You're muted also, Libby. It happens.
This technology thing. Thank you very much. Okay, so what do we want to think about if the US becomes your permanent home? So you may have been here for a while and perhaps your kids really have grown up as Americans. You think you're going to settle down and stay indefinitely. That's what I'm going to focus on. You can even, of course, imagine retiring here in the US as your home base. Your first thought, again, is probably on the question of immigration, which as a permanent home means going for either your green card or even US citizenship. So usually these decisions are triggered by career opportunities. So perhaps you got a promotion and you know you're going to stick around, or by family considerations. We certainly have clients whose children were born here in the US, which makes them automatically US citizens. So then the whole family decides that the better course is to naturalize. Sometimes people decide to become permanent residents just to make the travel in and out easier, or even consider the ability to vote to be really important to themselves. Regardless, the biggest concern and pause, the hesitation, really tends to be around those tax consequences and the idea of the IRS and tax reporting following you everywhere. If you stay in the US, of course, this doesn't really matter as nothing changes, but absolutely, you are locking yourself into a system where the tax preparation and administration will remain a hassle because of this possibility of this continuing reporting on your foreign assets. Your actual tax liability, however, may or may not be any greater because of that system of credits and exclusions that we were talking about before. But if you want to remain permanently, this opens up a whole world of investment possibilities. And you can start to complement and really supplement your retirement savings outside of the 401k and other workplace options with other types of investments, both tax advantaged and regular taxable ones. The first place that many of our foreign clients prefer to invest with their after-tax money is real estate. Sometimes that's because of a cultural affinity just for real estate as an investment. And this is great. You know, we love real estate too, because it is both an income producing, hopefully, as well as an appreciating asset. So it has a great place in a diversified portfolio. In addition, here in the US, it does have certain tax advantages, mostly due to that treatment of depreciation. And so it can really be a terrific investment. But we counsel our clients, please don't fall too much in love with real estate to the exclusion of everything else, because really we'd rather have real estate not represent more than 50% of your total net worth. And this is partially really simply because it's an illiquid asset. And as you approach retirement, you really have to think about balancing out your liquid assets as well to make sure you can support yourself. But as you build this more comprehensive investment program, we often do recommend that you consolidate your investments in the US. It is in your interest to hold your liquid investment accounts in the US to the extent possible. It may be, of course, that you cannot bring in certain retirement accounts, or that you should not bring in some foreign assets into the US because of unrealized capital gains and the potential for a negative tax impact. But from a practical standpoint, your life will be a lot easier by receiving proper US tax reporting from US institutions, which you just won't get when you're holding those accounts abroad. And in addition, through any accounts abroad, you may be investing in foreign pooled funds, really any non-US mutual funds or ETFs, and those can get pretty punitive US tax treatment, unfortunately. So as you build your nest egg here, you can take advantage of all types of different accounts that the US offers. So beyond the 401ks, there are IRAs, there are Roth IRAs, there's the ability to do Roth conversions, there are HSAs, there are 529 plans for education. There's really just a complete alphabet soup of different types of accounts here. And of course, there are the regular taxable brokerage accounts. We want clients to have access to the full range of accounts here in the US. The variety really here in the US is the most robust that you can find in the world. And in addition, the US also often has really much lower costs in general than elsewhere. So if you're staying here in the US, you can really benefit from the tax code to maximize and optimize your savings and build up all these different types of accounts that you can then draw upon in the future for a variety of purposes. So you have every opportunity to accumulate wealth and build up a sizable, well-diversified portfolio. Another example is if you do dream of starting up your own company, it is pretty easy here, and you can explore all the different business structures that will best suit your purposes. And of course, here in California in particular, that startup and early stage funding is very, very available. Later on in life, you can benefit from the US's generous estate tax exemptions and perhaps even use trust structures that will help pass wealth on to future generations. One quick comment, if you are planning on or thinking about retiring here, just to be familiar with which streams of income you will rely on in retirement. The first is your retirement accounts, which you can start to draw on without a penalty from age 59 and a half. In general, you must take what are known as required minimum distributions from the age of now 72 from accounts that are, let's call them the traditional type, and those will be fully taxed as income. Andrew mentioned Roth accounts before. Those are somewhat different, and they may not be taxable at all when you are withdrawing from those accounts in retirement. And the second important source here in the US is Social Security. And I just want to mention that it is possible to use credits that you built up in Germany, for example, to supplement Social Security credits here if you don't have enough to qualify. So all of these things can help you create and maintain a very, very comfortable lifestyle here in the US. But please keep in mind that what works in the US may not work abroad. So some types of accounts like Roths or other structures like trusts often don't travel very well. So if you're considering leaving the US in the future, please inform yourself before getting into any of these more sophisticated planning options. And so Andrew, if you want to talk about leaving. Now you're muted, Andrew.
Thank you, Libby. As I said, at some point, people do decide to leave the US. Lots of different reasons. Sometimes they're work related or family. It's very, very common, to be near their families, or even in retirement. We're even hearing more and more about things because of this whole remote work opportunity that is in the news, and I think it's going to be a real thing for quite some time, maybe from now forward. When people are ready to leave the US after they've been here a while, an immigration choice comes up that's very, very important. A lot of people who've been here for a while do want to preserve their access to the US. Maybe their kids are US citizens. Maybe they think their career may bring them back in the future. And so the most common is to seek citizenship or dual citizenship if it's possible. Sometimes some countries do not allow dual citizenship. I think Germany is one of those countries that's difficult. And in those cases, it becomes a more difficult decision for people. If folks have been here just on a simple visa, of course, it's not that difficult. You can just move away and give up your visa. If you have a green card holder, there really is if you have a green card, there really is a unique timeline. If you've had it for let's say under 7 years or so, you can simply give up your green card, turn it in, and move abroad, take your money with you, and move on with your life. I've heard that it can be much more difficult to get a green card again if you've done that. But if you've had a green card, I believe the rule is if it's over 7 years, I think the rule is within 8 different calendar years, so it's around 7 years, you're subject to the expatriation tax or the exit tax. And this really is the same tax that I would be subject to as a US citizen if I wanted to expatriate or renounce my citizenship. It's not very common. You hear news about expatriation is up, but it's still very, very, very small numbers of people, a couple thousand people a year. But we do see long-term green card holders get trapped up in this. And the rules are if your net worth is above roughly $2 million, or if you meet some relatively higher income thresholds, you're subject to this tax, which is very complex. But if I simplify it, it's essentially a deemed realization of any of your unrealized gains, as well as a deemed distribution from your qualified accounts to arrive at a tax. And it can be very, very high. So for green card holders who have had success in the US and they are approaching that 7-year mark, we really think planning is in order. Libby and I have a new client who's just signed on, who's been here 5 or 6 years, and we're doing exactly this thing. It's very common for us to help people weigh the pros and cons of that decision. So it's pretty interesting. Another thing is leaving a 401k or an IRA behind. As we said, almost everyone that we work with who's been here a while has a large 401k, or if they roll it into an IRA. The question, can I take an IRA or 401k with me? You cannot. To preserve the structure, it has to stay in the US. Of course, you could distribute it and pay all the tax and potentially a 10% early withdrawal penalty, but most people don't want to do that. Then the next question is, how is it taxed if I move abroad? And I'll go through this quickly, but if I divide it into 2 sections, if you've moved abroad and you have an existing balance in a 401k in the US, most countries will not officially consider it tax deferred, but it ends up being a gray area. They often stop short of expressly stating that they will not respect the tax deferred properties of a 401k in the US. And we've found that most foreign tax preparers will often treat a US 401k as though it were a tax deferred account in their own country. Sometimes that's because there is no tax reporting data. So for a foreign tax preparer, it would be really hard to even figure out taxable interest and realized gains and dividends and the like. Now, some countries have expressly stated that they do respect the tax deferred properties. The UK would be an example of that. Others, like Australia, have expressly stated that they're not respected. Now, many foreign workers here have a similar problem with tax advantage accounts abroad from when they worked abroad. And the US does not recognize most all of those foreign retirement plans as tax deferred. But likewise to the foreign tax preparers, it's really common that US taxpayers will treat them as though they were essentially a 401k account. Oftentimes it's because of a lack of data, and it would just be so much more complicated for them to try to report them as taxable. Now let me shift to, if you're living abroad and you begin to take distributions from an IRA or 401k. And this kind of depends on if you're still a US citizen or taxpayer or not. If you are a citizen or green card holder, you're generally going to be taxed by treaty in the country where you reside. They have the first right to tax that income. And then as a taxpayer, you're filing in the US, and you would report the income here as well and claim a foreign tax credit for the tax you paid in the foreign country. Of course, this means that those people need to self-report that income to whatever country where they live, which we're pretty sure doesn't happen all that often. If you're a non-resident, you've given up citizenship or a green card or a visa, you have to report, you have to register as a non-resident with the custodian of your 401k. When you take a distribution, there's going to be a mandatory withholding tax of usually around 30% or whatever per your treaty. And then the non-resident alien is supposed to self-report that income in the country where they live, and then pay tax there, and then file a non-resident return to claim the recovery of their withholding. We're pretty sure that doesn't happen all that often. Obviously, this is still relatively new and not that common that we see this, but it's going to be a bigger and bigger issue, obviously. Coordination of one's worldwide assets gets really important for any global citizen who's lived in multiple places. They tend to have assets in various countries. So they first have to figure out where they're going to retire. And then we love diving in and helping them figure out a plan for what assets to draw on and where their various sources of income are, and how to kind of build out that puzzle to make their life easy in retirement. So where do they have government pensions? And what are the rules around those pensions? What currency do they pay in? What about other income producing assets like rental properties? And then what other accounts do they plan to draw on, maybe with the least tax impact, or potentially some structures that they'd like to empty out first because they're less efficient? And really then just creating an easy administrative plan to bring all those things together and to, make life easy in retirement and be smart and manage the currency risks as well. The last point I'll quickly speak about is wills and estate planning. Of course, estate planning across borders can get extremely complicated and can be very daunting. And it's very hard often to know exactly what will happen to all your various assets upon your death. Partly this is true because there are very few international estate tax treaties with the US. So there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of gray areas. In general, international law is very much based on the situs or where an asset sits, if you will, is the country who has the right to apply their estate tax laws to that asset. We often recommend people that have assets in multiple countries kind of take a simple approach to this and simply just have a local will stating, a simple will stating their wishes in every country where they have assets, and maybe even have official translated copies of their other wills. So at the very least, all these countries have an understanding of what you want to see happen. Of course, the US has a very generous estate tax rules with approximately $12 million per person, which is exempted from estate tax. But for non-resident aliens with assets in the US, that exemption falls down to $60,000. So it could be substantially more expensive with US-based assets. That can be mitigated somewhat by estate tax treaties, as well as by credits or estate tax credits back to your home country, as well as by certain structures in the US that can help exempt certain assets from that non-resident estate tax. There's been a lot of information here. We'd like to answer some questions, but also just thank everyone for joining us and let you all know that we're committed to serving this unique community of people like you, who tend to be extremely interesting, very high achieving, and really a lot of fun for Libby and I to jump in and always be learning, which we love. So love to open this up to some questions, and Brody, our moderator, can maybe talk to us about what questions you've asked.
Yeah, thanks guys. A lot of good questions here. So try to kind of compile some. And if we repeat anything that we've already talked about, feel free to skip it. Just to start, what, if any, taxes does Germany place on US Social Security? And then I know that you touched on this in your presentation, but also 401k distributions.
You want me to take that?
We're both pausing, saying who's going to take it. I will start off by saying that, of course, we're assuming that the questioner is now residing in Germany. I guess that kind of goes without saying, so that Germany would have the right of first taxation, let's put it that way. And Germany would, in general, consider a retirement plan distribution to be income. And in general, they would assume Social Security as well. Now, often what happens is that some of the government benefits do get slightly preferential treatment. So oftentimes what we see is what happens in one country can be respected in the other. But in general, you should think of them as taxable income.
I was going to say the same, and just that sometimes within each country's tax treaty with the US are special treatment for things like Social Security. And so it just can't be certain if perhaps in your treaty the US reserves that right to tax. But I believe that it's all taxed in the resident country. That's fairly common.
Great. How does Germany tax non-residents' rental income, if you know?
Well, I can't answer that specifically. I think I'm going to assume what you mean is a rental property in Germany owned by someone who does not live in Germany. You think that's the question, Brody?
We've got a mix of questions. Just since we're diving into this, say that someone's a dual citizen and that German real estate was inherited. Is it advisable to invest in U.S. real estate instead? Are there ways to reduce the global gains on the sale? And if they didn't want to purchase more real estate, how would you recommend that they do invest those funds?
Yeah. Well, if they're residing in the U.S. and they inherit property, generally they're going to have a step up in basis for the U.S. Purposes. The income from which would mean that it may be less of a tax impact to sell that inherited property. However, of course, you have to look back to whatever the tax structure would be on the sale of the property in Germany. And that can vary from country to country. As far as the ongoing taxation of the rental income, again, the system in the US is always the same. It's the income minus the expenses minus the non-cash depreciation. So usually the tax is relatively sheltered in the US on rental property. Of course, there is going to always usually be a tax on that rental property in the foreign country. I can't be certain about Germany. Most countries follow a pretty simple structure of inflows minus the outflows. Some countries are different, however, and tax on the net value of the property. So I can't really speak to that. Do you know, Libby?
Yeah, let me just make one general comment about that. And I'm talking just about the treatment of rental income, not about whether you have inherited property or not. And that is that we have sometimes seen a situation where non-residents can have a different and often a higher tax rate for rental income than a resident would. And as Andrew mentioned, also sometimes there is an additional let's call it wealth tax that's just applied to a property. And so I get back to what we said earlier, and that is you just have to think about the construct that you're going to end up paying the higher of the two rates, whether the higher rates in Germany or the US. And in the US with rental property, the rates end up being very low. So it may be that your higher rate will be your cost in Germany.
Great. So someone is living in the US for more than 20 years and going into retirement. Also, congrats. Assuming you had moved back to Germany, how would health insurance be handled?
I'll just talk about it in general terms. Two things to keep in mind. I don't know the age of the person. Here in the US, you qualify for Medicare at age 65, and it's a very popular program here. But Medicare will not help you if you move back to Germany. So we often counsel people to keep their Medicare. The premiums can be quite reasonable, so that if you're going back and forth, for example, it's good to have that base of health insurance in the US, but Medicare will not cover you when you're outside the US, except for certain emergency situations. So if you are going to take up residence, again, let's assume in Germany, then you are going to want to set yourself up again, probably as a resident of Germany, and be able to take advantage of the health insurance that's available there. Or of course, there is often the opportunity to do private insurance that can be quite reasonable once you're outside the US.
Yeah, probably not a surprise to anyone on this call, but the challenges in financial planning and in retirement surrounding healthcare tend to always be with the US. Most foreign countries, it's generally a much more simple and widely available.
Sticking on that same topic of retirement, where will I be taxed if I live in the US and for retirement want to live half-time in Germany? And how is that controlled with counting of days?
Well, we'd rather not get into all the specifics of where, how to terminate residency in one place or another. I think very often it's around a certain number of days that you've spent, but those calculations can get very, very complicated. And it's not just whether you're deemed primarily a taxpayer in Germany or in the US. There's also a state to be worried about. And very often California can be one of the most difficult places to terminate your tax residency. So you want to go through, and really often starting with California, which if you're a California resident, the person on the call here, because they may be even more strict than US versus Germany. And so if you're able to terminate that residency with California, which is really based a lot around domicile, which the concept is it's where your intent to live. And they have all sorts of measurements, where you have a driver's license, where you're registered to vote, where your kids are enrolled in schools. So I really would focus on, I think most law focuses on your intent to live in a certain place. And obviously, if you're feeling like it's half and half, maybe that means you need to drift to one side or another and maybe make it 60-40. But just be very wary of a state like a New York or a California that's probably going to be even more aggressive than the IRS or the German tax authority.
Great. And that point on domicile between states brings up another question of, say someone has a lot of stock that has gained in value. Before retiring and selling the stock, does it make sense financially to move to another US state and sell there?
I'll start and I'll let Andrew finish this because we're both laughing a little bit because this comes up quite often, especially here in California, because California imposes as not what we would consider a capital gains tax. What they use instead is your income tax rate. And since that can be higher in California, lots of people think about moving before selling. And so, yes, that is something to consider. We want to point out that you do have to perhaps make somewhat of a differentiation between, let's call it a normal asset that would just be imposed a normal capital gains tax versus any sort of employment-based stock compensation that might vest over time or be exercisable over time, because one is considered, the way that I think about it is your property. And so if you move, you may be able to get a better capital gains tax treatment. But the second, if it's employment-based, then it's compensation. And even if you were to move, the location where you earned that compensation has the right to its share of the taxes.
Yeah, this is something Libby and I were just talking about with another client earlier yesterday. And this notion of states like California, there are certain types of stock compensation that were vested or granted while you were in the state, and they can be very, very aggressive about following you and making sure they tax you upon realizing that income. Now, other types of holdings, even if they're connected to an employment stock compensation program, very often you'll end up owning the shares outright. And at that moment, then you then own those shares. And so then they likely are not going to be following you. Likewise, just a standard portfolio. But then don't forget any asset that is located in the state, like say like a property, is likewise, even if you move to Nevada, which is beautiful this time of year, California is going to also seek to tax that as well. So it's, I guess we'll just sum up this question by saying you're absolutely right to be considering taxes as you're transitioning into retirement, obviously depending upon the value. It can make a lot of sense to spend a year or two in Texas before you then head out somewhere else. And we absolutely have clients doing just that. And sometimes even as a step to then moving abroad. So these are absolutely things to consider.
Great. Following that line of thought, if you are a permanent resident for more than 10 years, is there a difference in tax perspective to that of a citizen? And then also, are there differences in the high exemption of inheritance tax?
Really, as soon as you become a permanent resident in the US, your taxation is really identical to any other US citizen across the board, estate tax in all other manners. I guess the big difference is really just in your ability to terminate that at any moment with very minimal tax consequences up until you become what's known as a covered person, which is just having that green card within 8 calendar years, over around 7 years, at which point that separation is you are a covered person and subject to this exit tax. And we've seen it actually, one client we had go through and pay a large amount of exit tax was an individual who had a green card for nearly 30 years and at some point just was unable to keep it. So don't forget that there is some risk after having gone over that 7 or 8 year mark with a green card, where you may not have the choice. Maybe a move that where you've been forced to move and you're no longer able to qualify to keep it, or it can be taken away for various reasons. All of those lead you directly to having to go through expatriation and the exit tax.
Yeah, let me just make one small exception to that, which depending on your situation may not be so small. And that is with the estate tax laws in the US, the marital exception. So you can pass along without any tax consequences to a spouse here in the US, unless the spouse is not a US citizen. And there it's very clear, it's about citizenship. And there are ways to get around that. It doesn't have to be an issue, but just be aware that that is one area that you have to be educated about.
Great. There was a question that I actually answered in the Q&A, but just wanted to address to everyone. Yes, we are fiduciaries at all times, so we have your best interest at heart. The next question is, do the non-immigrant visa categories, like, for example, an e-visa, qualify for a permanent home, even if this person already intends to stay here, the US, for a long time?
Well, I would say we're not talking in this situation about visa differences. Okay, so when we're talking about extended stay, we're really just focusing on what can the opportunities that you have financially if you're here in the US for a few years. And really the whole area of different visas is not part of the conversation today.
Yeah. That's not something I have as much experience with. Should we maybe do one more, Brody?
Yeah, one thing that I know both of you have experience with, and we'll probably have some thoughts on, are 529 plans recommended for dual citizen children where it's not clear if they will study in the US or Europe in the future.
Yeah,
I'll
You
start
wanna-
off with that one. I have dual citizen children myself, and each of them has a 529 plan. I will say two basic comments because anything can get quite detailed and complicated, unfortunately, quite quickly. So just in general, two things to keep in mind. 529 plans are terrific while you are a resident of the US. And if you become a non-resident, then most, if not all countries that I'm aware of will not respect the tax deferment of a 529 plan. So that's comment number one. They're terrific plans to build up for educational savings while you are resident here. Aspect number two, when it might go more specifically to this particular situation, if your children are dual citizens and perhaps intending to go to university abroad, as two of my kids are now actually in Canada. So the 529 plan can be used for certain foreign universities. And there's a very specific system, and that is that the university has to have registered as an accredited institution with the Department of Education. And you can actually go online and you can find the list. And there are hundreds of foreign universities that have applied for that recognition. And so in those situations, the 529 can be used to pay for the tuition of those places. And I would say, go and take a look. In general, what's not surprising is that those institutions tend to be those that attract US students. And so they are predominantly Canadian, British, but there's certainly a smattering of institutions across Europe and elsewhere. But the preponderance are going to be in the English-speaking communities.
Okay, we're going to say goodbye here. Thank you all so much for tuning in. It's been a privilege to be on this call and have you all here. And please do reach out to any of us here at Worldview for anything more personalized. We're happy to have a free consultation with any of you. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Yep.